June 1916, a rest area in Béthune, France. British Lieutenant Robert Graves, a young officer and poet, stood observing the flow of men, not heroes, but ghosts. He saw the cold, psychological truth of the Western Front. Men so broken they were willing to risk madness, sterility, and agonizing pain just for a chance at a hospital bed. Graves would later write of the soldier's choice to deliberately invite disease, confirming that for a doomed generation, death was no longer the worst fate. It was a brutal contrast to the memory he carried from just 2 years prior. Graves recalled the telegrams that arrived in the summer of 1914, promising a great adventure. Boys from London and Berlin, from quiet French farms and industrial mills, rushed to the recruiting offices. They imagined glorious cavalry charges and a triumphant return home by Christmas. By the end of that year, the war had not ended. Instead, it had dug in. The entire Western Front, from the Belgian coast down to Switzerland, had become a maze of ditches and barbed wire. This was the birth of the trenches, and with it, the death of innocence. The stench hit before the sound, a mix of mud, rot, and something worse. In a trench barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, 19-year-old boys from Manchester, Picardy, and Saxony huddled shoulder to shoulder, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and constant shelling. The rain had not stopped for weeks. Rats fed on corpses half buried in the mud. Somewhere above, the thunder of artillery rolled like an endless storm. Down here, there was no glory, only waiting. Waiting for death, disease, or orders that would send them climbing out into machine gun fire. For many of these young men, the horror became so constant that dying no longer seemed the worst fate. They began looking for ways, any way, to escape the front lines. Some shot themselves, others faked madness. A soldier's note: "If madness means home, let me be mad." But there was another method, quieter, far more desperate, and far more shocking. They deliberately infected themselves with a deadly disease. To understand why a soldier would deliberately invite disease, you have to understand what the trenches really were. They weren't battlefields, they were graves that breathed. Miles of mud and wire stretching across northern France, Belgium, and beyond. Each one filled with boys who had stopped believing in tomorrow. The average soldier in those trenches survived barely 6 weeks. Shellfire came without warning. A friend could be laughing beside you 1 second and gone the next, swallowed by smoke and shrapnel. Mustard gas seeped silently through the fog, burning lungs and skin. Lice spread trench fever that burned through entire companies. Yet even in this living nightmare, there was no escape. Orders were absolute. Hold the line, no matter the cost. Any man who abandoned his post, even to save his own life, risked a firing squad. So they stayed, for days that turned into months until time itself began to blur. Letters from home arrived soaked in rain and blood. Birthdays passed uncounted. And the men who once dreamed of victory began dreaming only of rest, any rest, even if it came from fever, infection, or madness. That's when a desperate thought began to spread, whispered in the flickering light of the trenches. If a wound meant punishment, maybe an illness could mean salvation. At first, it began as a rumor. A quiet story passed between the shivering men at night. A soldier had heard about a man who fell ill in Amiens, sent to a hospital far from the front lines to recover. He had clean sheets, real food, sleep, and most importantly, silence. That rumor spread faster than the gas clouds that haunted their trenches. Soon, men began to wonder, what if sickness was the only ticket out? But feigned illness rarely worked. The doctors could tell. And self-inflicted wounds, a shot through the hand, a knife cut to the leg, were a death sentence if discovered. Military police patrolled hospitals for exactly that. Then came the darker, more plausible idea. If a man contracted a venereal disease, something like syphilis or gonorrhea, the army couldn't easily prove it was intentional. In the chaos of wartime leave, infection was common and plausible. It wasn't honorable, but neither was dying knee-deep in mud. The French system of licensed brothels, maisons tolérées, had existed long before the war. The military authorities, recognizing the needs of millions of idle, frightened men, allowed them to flourish in rear areas like Le Havre, Rouen, and Béthune. These establishments were strictly segregated by rank. The blue lamp brothels served officers with better comforts, while the red lamp houses were for the common soldiers. Sergeant Henri writes, "Blue lamp offered silk, red lamp offered escape, sometimes for good, For the women working there, the war was an explosion of demand driven by poverty and displacement. Some were professional sex workers subject to routine medical checks by the French army. Others were desperate, clandestine workers. It was in these grim, crowded places that the horrifying transaction occurred. An infected woman could charge a premium for what some soldiers called a guaranteed passage home. Infecting oneself wasn't about lust. It was a calculated act of self-preservation. Some accounts even mention soldiers passing the infection from one man to another using matchsticks. The military toll was staggering. By 1916, venereal disease accounted for 1 in 5 admissions to British and Allied hospitals in France and Belgium. Over the course of the war, this resulted in the loss of service equivalent to keeping an entire army division, over 40,000 men, out of the line at any given time. For those who succeeded in their desperate strategy, the symptoms came within days: fever, rash, pain. They'd report to the medic, be transferred to a dedicated hospital behind the lines, and begin treatment with mercury, a poison meant to cure another poison. It was agony, but it meant 30 days away from the front, 30 days of air without gunfire, 30 days to feel human again. Mother, I am safe for now. Please don't ask me how. I just want to sleep. Letter home, hospital at Rouen, 1917. They knew the risk: infertility, madness, even death. But compared to the trenches, those odds felt merciful. The hospital beds were cleaner, yes, the food was better, the silence almost sacred. But as the men lay there, trembling under mercury blankets, many realized they had merely traded one form of torment for another. Mercury treatment was crude, slow, and cruel. It made their gums bleed, their skin blister, and their bones ache. Some went half mad from the poison. Others never recovered their strength. The lucky ones returned to the trenches alive. The unlucky left in coffins marked non-combat death. Diary of Lance Corporal Franz Hofer. I can't recall the date. The doctor says it was Wednesday. I walked in and said I felt sick. He looked at my hands, too clean for wounds. He knew. They suspected what was happening, but most said nothing. Perhaps they pitied these boys, or perhaps they understood that punishing them would change nothing. There were always more bodies coming in and more leaving in silence. Among the soldiers, the stigma was quiet but real. Those infected were whispered about. They were laughed at by some, envied by others. But no one could judge too harshly, because everyone in the trench had, at some point, thought of doing the same. Diary, Private Charles Harris. My friend said he would rather die coughing than screaming. I did not argue. And so it became an unspoken truth of the Great War, chronicled by observers like Graves. That disease could be a mercy, and death could be a relief. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the men who returned home carried more than scars. They carried guilt, for surviving when others didn't, for choosing infection over honor, for discovering that fear could outlast courage. Many never told their families. The war ended on paper, but in their minds the trenches never closed. History remembers the Great War for its weapons, its treaties, its maps redrawn in blood. But in truth, the greatest casualty wasn't land or empire, it was innocence. Millions of young men were sent to fight a war that none of them truly understood. They grew up in weeks, died in hours, and those who lived were never the same again. The trench wasn't just a place, it was a transformation. It stripped away every illusion of glory, every sermon of patriotism. It showed that beneath the medals and flags, the human spirit had limits, and the Great War found them all. When a boy willingly sought out a deadly disease just to escape the sound of guns, it wasn't cowardice. It was a revelation. It showed that the machinery of war had pushed humanity past the point of reason. It wasn't just flesh that broke, it was the idea of what it meant to be civilized. In those cold, waterlogged graves, the world glimpsed its own reflection and saw what progress, pride, and empire really cost. Decades later, when people spoke of never again, they rarely mentioned the quietest victims, the ones who survived by wounding themselves in secret. But they were proof of something essential, that even in hell, the instinct to live, no matter how desperate, is stronger than the orders of any general or the honor of any flag. As the lamps of Europe finally flickered back to life, the soldiers who once hid from death in the arms of disease returned home to a world that couldn't understand them. Their names were forgotten, their stories buried with them. But in the mud, beneath the ruins of those trenches, lies the truth of their generation. That war didn't just kill the body, it taught men to destroy themselves to stay alive. And perhaps, in the most tragic way, That is what made the First World War, the moment when humanity first learned how to die on an industrial scale and live with it.